Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back from your lunch. Hopefully you had some nice refreshments, but also some energizing conversations. So we're going to continue that with the panel this afternoon. I'm Kate Warren. I'm Executive Vice President, Executive Editor at Devex, and really delighted to be moderating this, I just mentioned, womanal women, talking about advancing global development by empowering women. We know that investing in women's economic empowerment is not only the right thing to do, it is also the smart thing to do. The data shows us that when women thrive, economies and communities grow stronger and more prosperous. Yet there are some shifting geopolitical and foreign aid contexts right now. And so we really need to find new pathways to sustain progress. With traditional development assistance declining, there is this kind of growing sense, a bit of a zero-sum game between different priorities and a renewed emphasis on value for money. And so I think both the data and some of the real-world case studies we'll hear from today in the panel will show us that investing in women's economic empowerment really provides a lot of bang for your buck. And it really can help spur development in other areas like health and agriculture, education, so good governance. So really, women are the bedrock of many societies, and helping their growth really helps growth for us all. So to help us understand this better, I'm really delighted to be joined by some amazing women who are at the forefront of this work and help us really understand the economic case for investing in women, some of the barriers and opportunities, some examples of this in action, and some ideas for a path forward. We will hopefully have a little time for Q&A at the end, so if you do have any questions, jot them down, and we'll try to get to some of those. But first, let me introduce our panelists. We have, right here to my left, Nicole Goldin, who's the head of Equitable Development for the United Nations University Center for Policy Research, and also a non-resident senior fellow here at Atlantic Council. As an economist, she has led a lot of research on inclusive growth, and so look forward to hearing from her. We also have Sophie Sirtaine at the end, who's the CEO of CGAP, which you probably know, but is housed within the World Bank and drives financial inclusion by advancing research policy and innovation for low-income communities. And we have Hudock, who's the president and CEO of Counterpart International. It's a global nonprofit that strengthens communities by building inclusive, resilient, and locally led solutions for sustainable development. So I'm really delighted to have these three different perspectives on the panel today. And Nicole, I'm going to start with you just on kind of the big picture case for the economic case for investing in women. Talked about there are dynamics right now with shrinking foreign aid, some different geopolitical tensions, and that sense of a bit of a zero-sum game between priorities. And so I want to hear, what is the case for prioritizing women's economic inclusion as a bedrock for good development? And what does the data show on why this makes just good old-fashioned sense?
Good old-fashioned sense.
Yeah.
Thanks, Kate. And it's great to be back at the Atlantic Council and to see so many friends and colleagues and you all in the room. It is, of course, International Women's Month, and we're having this conversation here while up in New York is the UN Commission on the Status of Women, and I've been participating in some of those conversations over the last week and this week. So I'm really amped up, for this conversation, and in particular to answer and address that very question. As you said, investing in women's economic empowerment is not just the right, it's the smart and strategic thing to do. And from an economics perspective, but it's not just from the prosperity perspective. It also can pay peace dividends, and it can pay dividends on social progress. And of course, all of those three things both contribute to each other, and they're mutually reinforcing. So I think while this conversation is oriented around the economics piece, I think it's important to kind of bring that out in the developmental context, that there are positive spillovers into other areas, as you mentioned, in health and whatnot. But on the economics piece, As you said, studies have shown, and the data shows that it's important. And if I give one headline figure for everyone to kind of take away, studies have shown that women's economic participation globally can contribute to $7 trillion in global GDP, which is a pretty significant number when you think about some of the challenges that we're having in the global economy, and in particular in much of the global South. And this gain from better and more women's economic empowerment results from diversification of economies, from higher productivity, and from more spending in the economy. And we'll sort of get into that a little bit more. But right now, to your point, these gains, in particular in the global South and among the global majority countries or populations, as you know, we'll talk a little bit more about global majority from a financial inclusion perspective, have really important developmental impact. Most, if not many, if not most developing economies are dealing with constrained fiscal space due to not only declining foreign assistance, which we can talk more about, but also debt and the burdens of debt and debt servicing. And this means that they have less ability to invest in education and health and some of these, and infrastructure and some of these other areas, again, that reinforce economic growth. So what that means is, in this context, domestic resource mobilization becomes even more critical. And that means increasing women's participation, business, and economic activity are really important means to raise government revenues and, again, contribute to economic growth. And one of the last things I'll say, you know, because that headline number is, I'm sure, sitting with you all, is that women's economic empowerment is known to pay generational dividend. So we want to think about sort of that immediate sort of injection that increasing women's participation in the economy can give to growth. But also, we know that women take their earnings and they tend to invest a higher share of that in health and education in their household. And so that pays that generational dividend. And so if we want to think about long-term resilience, and I know something we might come back to, it's really just critical to empower women.
Well, so you mentioned domestic resource mobilization, and you know, there's been a lot of talk about how that being really critical in this moment of declining foreign aid, but also the debt burdens, inflation that's still happening everywhere becomes a really tricky. So what would you like to see, or what are you seeing governments do to prioritize this within their policymaking and budget process amidst challenging times?
Absolutely. So I would put it into kind of three kind of main buckets. And the first is really that general economic governance and kind of thinking about, as you said, the kind of macro picture. And this is in terms of fiscal policies, you know, tariff policies. We talked about sort of the tax revenue and generation side, but we want to see, and we are seeing governments thinking how they're doing gender responsive budgeting, for example, or how you can implement tariff and tax policies to avoid so-called pink tariffs, which is the fact of where you have goods or services that women are more likely to use, often expensive. So this is, you know, an issue about inflation, as you say, because women tend to bear the brunt of inflation in that way. So that's sort of the one bucket. But then there's also the whole slew of kind of sort of policies and laws that create the enabling environment, and we'll hear a lot more about this, I know, from Anne and Sophie, but create the enabling environment where women can participate in the labor force and start in their business. And that's, you know, things related to living wages and pay equity, things related to leave policies and having flexibility. And then it's the slew, we talked a bit this morning about the importance of the sort of rule of law. So when you think about how those kinds of, whether it's property rights, inheritance laws, for agriculture-oriented economies, which are so many of the global South, where women play a huge role, how do we have land tenure and some of those kinds of laws on the books that can better, again, create that enabling environment where women can earn and thrive and protect their assets. And then, of course, investments in infrastructure. And we don't necessarily think of these strategies as promoting women's economic empowerment. They're good for the economy and growth in general, but they can have particular impacts when done sensitively to the needs of women and safe transportation to get to and from work or school. When we want to think about the digital divide, and I'm sure we're going to hear a lot more about the importance of digital financial systems and banking, we'll hear more about from my colleagues. And then, of course, we can't think about women's economic participation and the challenges that have been really brought to bear if we don't talk about care infrastructure. On average, somewhere between 2 and 40% of shares of GDP is accounted to women's unpaid work, which limits their ability to do paid work, and a lot of that is because the care infrastructure is not there. So that's a real big one. And then sort of related to that enabling environment, just last point is, again, thinking about that downstream and thinking about investing in education and training, not only for young women. Female youth are much more likely to be unemployed or not in education or training, but also in aging society where women want to stay in the workforce longer and need to maybe have that training and reskilling in order to be able to stay and work. So there's a lot of opportunities, there's a lot of space, and we're starting to see some shifts, but not fast enough.
Okay.
Yeah, more to come.
So Sophie, I'd love to bring you in and kind of, again, looking at this more a little bit the local lens, and how can local financial institutions and policymakers really invest in women and close often this big gap, particularly in access to capital?
Thank you for the question. Yes, maybe I'll start with the end of your question. The access to capital between men and women is strikingly different, with only 2% of capital going to women-led businesses. So that's strikingly abysmal. And if you think about access to finance more broadly, which is a key enabler of economic empowerment and prosperity and growth, you have more than 700 million women in the world that have access to no financial services at all, not even a mobile account. That's more than the population of Europe, to put it in perspective. You also mentioned, I like to put things in perspective, that $7 trillion could be generated in wealth and prosperity for the world with women's economic empowerment. That's twice what is needed to close the SDG gaps. So clearly a lot is at stake. Now, you're asking, what do policymakers and financial institutions need to do? And of course, there's a lot of things, but I'd like to simplify and focus on the essence. So I'll say two things: data and innovation. And the first reason is, first, I think we need to make the case. What gets measured gets acted upon. The business case to serve women and the economic case to serve women is very strong. We just talked about the economic case. From a business perspective, there's also a very strong, and especially from a financial sector perspective, a very strong business case. Women tend to save more than men. Their propensity to save is higher, and the return on these savings is higher, as you mentioned. What is maybe less known is that women are also, in general, better borrowers than men. And for instance, the IFC has been publishing for 10 years data that shows that at the retail, micro, but also medium firm size, there is a 1% difference in favor of women in terms of non-performing loan, which is very significant. They're also typically more loyal customers. So first, you need to make the business case, and for that you need data. You need to understand who the women are that are underserved and compute the business opportunities. But then, even if you had that, serving women in their lived realities is often much more complicated than serving men, for many of the reasons that, Nicole, you mentioned. And they typically relate to gender norms. So first, of course, as you mentioned, the labor force participation of women is significantly lower than men, 50% versus 80%. In some countries, South Asia, the Middle East, it's less than 30%. They're also more likely to be employed in agriculture, in gig work, in informal economies, which basically means that their cash flows tend to be lower and more volatile. So much more difficult for financial institutions to serve them, and much more costly. The transaction size is too small. In addition, because of all the reasons that you discussed this morning, women are often not able to produce to a financial institution the types of documentation that is needed. In particular, They're less likely to own assets, especially real estate assets that are needed for collateral in most jurisdictions. They're less likely to have the credit histories that are needed to base credit decision in most jurisdictions again. They're also less likely to be able to travel to a financial institution, sometimes to even interact with financial agents that are typically male in most countries. So there's a lot of gender norms and barriers that are related to the role of women in societies that make it more difficult for financial institutions to serve them. And yet there are solutions to that, and it's all about digital and data. You can assess the creditworthiness of a woman today using alternative data if she is digitally active, for instance, in an e-commerce platform. And you can do that with the same quality as with credit histories. You no longer need the collateral, probably. You can do KYC, so you can acknowledge a customer with just an ID that you can check in a kiosk in a village. You don't need the woman to go to head office in the city. That may be difficult for her. So really mobile money, digital financial services, and leveraging data is a game changer for women's financial inclusion and economic participation.
Yeah, and I'd love to, and I think you laid out a lot of those barriers really, really well, and particularly some of the opportunity technology and digital tools can provide. Do you have any really concrete examples of that you could share of how you're seeing it at work in practice?
Yeah, I mean, you can think about markets or you can think about institutions. And so typically markets where you've seen real progress in women's financial inclusion and economic participation, such as, for instance, Brazil would be one. For financial inclusion, India is getting there too, are markets where you see first that governments have invested in a digital public infrastructure, but one that is inclusive. So IDs that are available to everyone, including women, digital payment systems that are instant, effective, enable e-commerce to work, digital data trails to be generated, but also connectivity and access to phones, especially smartphones, that is inclusive. And in a lot of countries, you have incredible gaps between rural and urban areas in connectivity. For instance, everybody knows about M-Pesa, Kenya, mobile money, and there the access to mobile money is about 80%. It's been increasing rapidly. You'd be surprised to know that in rural area, it's less than 50%, and for women in these areas, it's even lower. So you still have massive gaps in connectivity. So that's one thing we need to really fix. It's the digital public infrastructure. And I think the second is the gender disaggregated data. Again, if you want a financial institution to be able to serve women, understand their needs, their segmentation, you need gender disaggregated data. So institutions that have leveraged those environments, like in Brazil and elsewhere, there's a lot of them. There's the BBVA foundations across Latin America, Mercado Pago, which is an e-commerce fintech, or New Bank in Brazil. You have a Time Bank in South Africa. What they have in common is that first they've simplified access for women. So you get your account set up in a kiosk in a village. They've done a touch and tech combination of services. There is an agent that is available to help women set up their accounts. For instance, Mercado Pago in Brazil has a massive agent networks. They bring the digital and financial literacy of the person at the same time. They teach the women to open an e-commerce platform, but at the same time, they give them a point of sale to become digitally active. They've leveraged alternative credit scoring system. So then Time Bank has developed an alternative credit scoring method to assess women's risk. It's gender disaggregated on the basis of their e-commerce digital transactions. They typically also have a more integrated offer where on the app, the person also has access to, for instance, weather information, information about agriculture, access maybe to a marketplace where they can sell. So it's a lot of additional products that compensate for the fact that women often are less business savvy, digitally savvy, and financially savvy than men. So it does exist, it does happen.
It's always good to hear the good examples. So, Sophie, you mentioned 2% of capital goes to women-owned businesses. And Anne, you at Counterpart work to support a lot of women entrepreneurs. And so I'd love to hear how you see that going hand in hand with financial inclusion, and what are some of the barriers for the women entrepreneurs that you support?
Sure, thank you for that. You know, I think a lot's been said that really captures the Counterpart approach. And at the core, financial inclusion, of course, is really about access, and it's about transforming systems. And the entrepreneurs who we work with, you know, through their work, when given investment, that's exactly what is happening for them, is that opportunity is creating that transformative systems approach. And so when we work with entrepreneurs, we have really three ways that we think about this. The first is that we are actually trying to shift systems. We're not just accepting the status quo. And by definition, working with women in many of these economies is a shift. I'll never forget being in a room with some investors who said, the best way to get to women is shrink it and pink it. And I think we can go beyond that, right? So we're trying to transform those systems. The second thing is that we're looking at profit and people. It's not one or the other. And we believe that those two things can go hand in hand, and we've seen it. And the third thing is that we are looking for impact alongside of investment. And that's where it probably gets the most complicated, because we could spend a lot of time discussing over what time frame and what are the inputs that are also needed in addition to that investment. But you know, we know from our work what it takes for women to succeed. And that is really the key, because it isn't about shrinking it and pinking it. And you've highlighted so well, I think, some of those barriers that need to be addressed if this investment is ever going to be used in meaningful ways. But one of the things I'd really like to highlight is that at Counterpart, we have a global network of women, entrepreneurs, who have gone through this training. The network itself dates back to 1978. It covers the globe. And so these women are peer-to-peer supports. They can be mentors to one another. They are certainly role models for one another to see who has done what and how have they succeeded. And all of them can be deployed in service of change in the ways that we talked about with transforming systems. You know, and I think it's really important to, as we talk about women, really disaggregate that. Again, as Sophie said, really disaggregating that data, because it's not a monolithic group. And the underserved and underrepresented people getting access to capital and decision-making opportunity, that's really, I believe, where the financial inclusion piece comes in. And so to close, the comments I would make is that, you know, we're really looking at ensuring that women's readiness as entrepreneurs is front of the agenda, top of the agenda. I think there's a lot of discussion about getting capital into the hands of women because of the dire statistics that you've both highlighted, and that is very important. And in addition, we really have to think about how do we make sure that when women get the capital, they're ready to use it. And in addition to being ready to use it, they have the supports around them, including from our network or other networks people may be a part of, in order to succeed.
Yeah, so you talked about how, you know, the mentorship and networks is not just capital, it's really wrapping that all around. But often you hear that we should just train the women, right? And have them they're doing something wrong, have them fix it themselves and train them on how to work in this system, when a lot of it really is systemic barriers. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on, you know, how to build economic systems that are more inclusive of women while recognizing the need to offer access to capital and training and mentorship.
You know, it's a big question, and we could dedicate an entire panel to that. I think, you know, you have to work at the grassroots and you have to work at the policy level. You can't pick and choose. If you want to make system reforms, it has to be both and. And I don't suggest that any one organization needs to cover the waterfront on that, but for example, Counterpart, you know, has done a lot of research on gender apartheid in Afghanistan. And so we have a lot of data and experiences that can inform our approach to advocacy and to policy reform at that level where an entire population of an entire country is being cut out of the economy. And I think we have to recognize in discussions where we are frankly blaming women for the gaps. You know, there have been so many, even this month with all the panels and all the discussions around women's economic participation, that, well, women are not doing the right thing. Women aren't asking in the same way men are. Women aren't accessing capital in the same way. And that may be true. There may be supports that should be put into place for women to grow in their confidence. And I can tell you from our network that that is probably the most foundationally transformative piece of the training they get, is when they grow in their confidence, that they're certainly able to do more. And at the same time, that systemic change has to come from really thinking about the underserved and recognizing that the needs of underserved entrepreneurs are different than the needs of others. For example, you know, we see a lot of women entrepreneurs who suffer from burnout. And so part of our training involves mental health and leadership retreats. And that's really important because we know entrepreneurship is very demanding. You've highlighted the lack of care in the economy for, you know, women who are holding that child care or elder care. And, you know, so we're trying to integrate in what we do that self-care, self-reflection, coaching, peer support, all of which I believe will help to shift the systems while it also helps to empower the women.
Yeah, I think it's looking at helping women operate in the reality that we're in now while also trying to shift that reality.
Yes.
So Nicole, I want to talk about private sector. So that's been the other big thing, right? As foreign assistance is going down, role for private sector to step in. And so where are you seeing private sector play, and where do you think private sector should play in including more women in the financial systems?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think one of the big ways built off of something Sophie said, which is investing in innovation and research and development to develop products and services that better serve the needs of women. And this isn't necessarily a shrink and pink. I love that phrase because that is an issue. But it's being more sort of intentional in truly designing. And we're seeing that, for example, obviously in the financial services sector. But I mean, it could be anything from agriculture machinery and tools that better, fit and are nimble and work better for women or lighter or what have you. So, I mean, I think there's a range, but I think starting with, again, creating the products and services that better enable women to engage. Building on something Anne said, working through the private sector to break those social norms. And for example, companies that are working in quote, non-traditional areas, and hiring and training, and again, building that pipeline for women to enter into these careers and be part of the conversation around, with families and with the community in places where there may be more limited career pathways for younger women and for girls to engage. And so, creating that opening and being part of that conversation. Certainly sort of partnering with governments in a variety of ways. But I talked earlier about some of the policies and laws, but the private sector can get ahead of that, right? They need to meet sort of basic minimum wage laws, but can set their own, right? So creating pay equity, making sure that they have zero tolerance policies and training programs in place about discrimination or harassment in the workplace, which is a really important issue in a number of countries. And we're seeing rises in gender-based violence and harassment, and that can really be a barrier for women to participate in the economy. So they can really get ahead on that, supporting women's networking, and as was mentioned. And then certainly also engaging, looking intentionally and engaging women-owned businesses in their supply chains. If they're a sort of a larger company that has its value chains and supply chains, and engaging women entrepreneurs and supporting through the system is really critical. So I think there's a variety of ways, and the good news is that it's a space where we're starting to kind of see that, and they can lead by example, like I said, on pay equity, on providing care, on transportation, on financial services and digital access. So there's lots of ways they can lead, and I think being part of that conversation and partnering is really key.
Yeah, so we're, those of us in the room here sitting in the US, I know we have people maybe joining online elsewhere, where there's been a bit of a retreat on programs that target women, whether government funded or the private sector. So Sophie, I'd love to hear kind of how you're thinking about still messaging, talking about the importance of this, just given the current political climate around, we even joked, are we allowed to say women anymore in the panel? But what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think it comes back to the first question. It's really about making everyone understand the value that we are all leaving behind by not including women, and the value for us and for generations to come. The economic value, but also the social value, and for all the reasons you were mentioning, women ability to join the workforce and to contribute economically can unleash a massive amount of economic value for all. They also tend to invest more, as you said, in education and in households, so that's a long-term generational benefits. One thing we haven't talked about is that they're also better at savings for shocks. So in a world that is shattered much more by economic, financial, other shocks than before, women are agents of resilience often. And they're also agent of peace, and we see that in many environments. And so, I think it's coming back to that. The other thing that I'll add is to your list, Nicole, of what is important. I think having more women in management would change the conversation, maybe de facto. You only have 29% globally of managerial positions that are held by women, and 6% only of CEO positions. The very reason we're discussing, for instance, the fact that it's not about just shrinking and pink it, or it's not just about that we need to transform products to fit women's livelihoods and needs, it's only because at the start, all of this has been developed with a mental frame that has been dominated by men's needs. And it's just natural that women are different. We are different, and we play different roles. So it shouldn't even be a surprise or a problem that women need products and services that are different. They just have been developed with this notion that they were gender neutral, but in fact they were not. The frame, the mirror, the lens that was applied was that of a male's knife. And so I think it's very important to involve more women in decision-making in the financial sector and elsewhere to change de facto that thinking.
Can I just pick up on that super quick? Absolutely. I mean, I couldn't agree more. And when we were talking earlier about what are some of the shifts we need to see in the sort of policy-making space, and again, I mentioned, coming from sort of the UN and the multilateral system, the economic governance piece is really critical. And I mean, it should have been the first thing I said was starting the conversation by engaging more women in the process, but also in the leadership. And this is at the national level in sort of economic and financial policy roles and decision-making roles at the highest levels where it tends to be pretty weak, but also in the international institutions themselves. I mean, there have been studies of the multilateral development banks and the other international financial institutions. Never had a woman lead the UN, right? Or the World Bank. We have had it, luckily, at the IMF, and currently do. But and it's not just the top, but the sort of top range, and even again into that pipeline, right? From middle management and up. And inclusive governance is a really critical piece of inclusive growth. And I think if you don't have that representation, as part of the management and the policy and the governance, you're just not going to have the outcomes. Sorry, yeah.
No, thank you. I wanted to add 2 points to that, so thank you for teeing it up. The first is that I think if we have to prioritize, we should prioritize getting women onto boards. And that is an area that is deeply under threat right now. You know, we all know the numbers, that women are not represented in the ways that they should be on boards, and recent changes here in the US have made it less likely that women will be on boards, or that companies will seek out to have proactive approaches to vetting that talent, or, as you so rightly said, bringing a talent pool through so that they can elevate to those levels. So that, if I were to choose one thing that we need to be really thinking about in terms of governance, it would be getting women onto boards. The second thing I wanted to highlight that we haven't mentioned, and I think is really important as we think about inclusive systems, is that not investing in women's businesses, it doesn't only shortchange the women, it shortchanges the investors. Because now you only have a certain set of solutions that you're offering to these investors. And I think we need to spend more time turning that equation around and talking about what is the harm to investors by offering such a narrow slice of solutions. The challenges we face in our countries and in our economies are vast and they're complex. And a narrow set of solutions designed by a pretty homogenous group who's receiving this venture capital is probably not going to get us there.
Yeah, I think when resources are scarce, there can be more of this, again, that zero-sum sense of competition, which I think has contributed to some of that that's happening here in the US and other places in the world. I'd love to hear how you think about including men and boys in these conversations. I mean, often it is women who are leading them and leading this work. But where you see the role for men and boys in the conversation and the work. I don't know if anyone wants to grab that one. Nicole.
Sure. I'll kick off and please chime in. I mean, I think it's an absolutely, kind of critical point. I think one of the challenges that we've seen in kind of making the case for, investing in women and trying to promote the policies is this idea that it is zero sum, and that by trying to get more women into work, that the job's going to be taking. So I think part of it is having conversations with communities, and at the family level is having conversations at the family level, right, to encourage, to make sure that the girls in the family can go to school, right? Again, thinking downstream, thinking generational, thinking long term. But it's also about, again, at some of the more macro level, is ensuring that when you're investing in these policy reforms, that you're cognizant of where there may be trade-offs, right? And where there may, real or perceived, because sometimes it's, to your point, it's a perception of, and making sure that you're sort of taking steps to support men and boys in communities, in families as well, so that there is, you can sort of, it's not one or the other, or you can at least mitigate an offset where there's that. And at the macro level, I look at, for example, right now, a big conversation that's related to this in the UN is the upcoming fourth Financing for Development conference, which is happening in Sevilla this summer. It's the pickup, for many of you may be familiar with, the sort of Addis Ababa agenda. Sophie mentioned the $4 trillion current SDG financing gap. So as part of this lead-in process that's been already underway for financing for development, sort of equity and inclusion and mitigating inequalities are front and center as part of that conversation. And in those conversations, in these sort of macro multilateral, there is space, I think, to engage men, maybe not boys in that sense, but to engage men. And I think lastly I'd say is, going back to at the kind of programmatic level, is thinking through some of these, again, especially for young people, and sort of bridging that pipeline and changing social norms and behaviors from early on, is thinking about the kinds of programs where you can have boys and girls together, whether it's sports programming, whether it's, music and arts, and sort of those, thinking about creating those spaces and utilizing those kinds of platforms and spaces and policies and programs to kind of educate, bring people together, and help break down some of those norms for generations.
Yeah, and you mentioned the Financing for Development Summit. I think that's going to be important in a moment because everyone is thinking about how are we going to fill some of these financing gaps. There's growing need, and really around the need for collaboration between the multi-sector system, multilateral system, private sector, governments. So I'd love to hear like how you think that works, all those different components coming together. And Sophie, I'll put you on the spot on this one. How do you think that we can have more collaboration and be able to get, again, more value for our money by all collaborating across those different actors?
I mean, first, your question is fundamental. I absolutely believe that it can only be done if the public and the private sector and actually the nonprofit sector all participate. The public sector has an enormous job to do to create a more inclusive ecosystem in many countries, including starting with the digital ecosystem that is still, in my opinion, very uninclusive in many countries. So bridging those gaps is fundamental because everything is going to be digital in the future, and so those who are left behind will be further behind. They also need to put in place an enabling regulatory and legal framework, as we were discussing before, an education framework, governance roles, etc., that are inclusive. But the private sector is a massive opportunity here and role to play. They can leverage those technologies, those innovations, to serve in a more inclusive way the entire population of their countries. And so they have a role to play in leveraging the data, leveraging the technology, seeing, not being blind to the needs of half of the population in their countries, and tailoring, segmenting the data, tailoring the design of their products, recruiting more women, all of this. But I think there's one angle that we haven't discussed that is at the intersection of the two, which is that we also need smart subsidies. And blended finance fundamentally. And that's where the role of the public sector needs to complement the role of the private sector in a smart way in a world where there's so little money available everywhere. And that is because getting to people, and especially women, at the last mile in rural areas, especially with products, for instance, such as insurance against, say, climate shocks, things that are economically difficult to develop, will require, actually, I think it's unavoidable, subsidies, risk mitigation, risk-sharing instruments to be deployed. Of course, they need to be smart. I use that word very specifically because we have scarcity of fiscal resources and ODA. So they need to be targeted really where there is a market failure, so at the last mile for the initial inception of a product, etc. But that intersection, the blended finance intersection, will play a key role.
So we are going to open it up for audience Q&A in just a moment. So if you have questions, I believe there are a couple microphones around. But before we get to that real quick, and we've been talking a lot of big picture and the policy and the data, and you work with so many women. I'd love to hear if you have like a story of someone and seeing this in practice and why this is so important and impact that it can have.
I'd be happy to share that. Thank you. I think that is the important thing to remember, is that it is about individual lives. And, before I quickly give you a story, it's just to say that the data shows us that, providing financing to women entrepreneurs without providing them training actually leads to higher loan default rates. So we know that the approach works. But I can give you a recent example from Suriname, where we were working with Hess Oil, and they have invested in the women in that country. This is the second year that we have been back for a training of the cohort there. And just in the space of that week training, 5 days even, one of the women received a $500,000 bank loan. And she started the week less secure. I mentioned confidence. She was not quite so confident. By the end of the week, she had marched into the bank and she had secured a $500,000 bank loan. So that's pretty impressive. We also have stories, from across the globe. As I mentioned, our Global Women in Management training is funded by the ExxonMobil Foundation, and they, have done this year by year. So there's a whole lot of stories, but just quickly, some of the statistics there is that last year's graduates, 70% gained financial decision-making control over their businesses. 86% now have greater autonomy over their spending, and 23% increased their income by at least 5%. 18% expanded their businesses by at least 5%. So capital alone isn't going to solve these challenges, nor will training alone, but this combination, I think, and the network that kind of comes around it and supports them is a proven approach that if we wanted to pick up something and replicate at scale, I would suggest the data and the anecdotal stories tells us that's a smart investment.
Great, thank you. All right, I know there was a couple of questions. Yeah, like this one back here, and do we have a mic that we can get? I think there's one coming just your way. And for those who are tuning online, you are able to submit questions that I will be able to see up here.
Thank you so much for the insightful panel. And I want to ask you if the World Bank and the United Nations have initiative on women advocacy work. And also, I would like these panelists to invite and challenge you to visit Karakal, Pakistan, where average life expectancy is 55 years, with high alarming infant mortality rates. And women are sterilized without their consent. And women who try to voice these issues, they end up in prison, and they are brutally tortured. They become disabled. So we really need the advocacy work. And some women try to go to neighboring countries where they end up in human trafficking. So Counterpart International, you mentioned about women entrepreneur programs. It would be fantastic if you had your program in Karakal, Pakistan. It's one of the world's harsh places, and nobody goes there. And I believe these women here, they are very special. They are genuine about women's rights. And I challenge you to come and do something about it. Be our voice, because in Uzbekistan, if I speak up, I would be murdered or imprisoned in the best way. Thank you.
Thank you. We're going to take a couple questions and then get to all of those. Just make sure we maximize time. And so, yeah, that one back there.
Oh, hi, I'm Disha, and thank you so much for this panel. So my question to you all would be: amazing women leader from the leadership perspectives, those of us who are like going back to workforce. And in this political climate, where there is, like, we are not able to kind of like talk about DEI, no DEI initiatives, or similar kind of things. My background comes from like international development and international security. And I was involved with a few projects which were about aquaculture for rural women. And we kind of like gave them interventions and tried to see like how they were reacting. And we saw like how their like household income was increasing. So I kind of like fear that right now, with all the development challenges, the challenges in finding the right amount of money or allocating the resources in all those programs, it's going to get like a lot affected. So my question to you would be like, how do we kind of like tweak our research agenda to make it more digestible to the policymakers and people who are going to make the decisions, but also kind of like stay in touch with the originality of the project, but be very politically correct and kind of like very much with the current perspective. Thank you.
And we'll do one more up here. And I think there's a mic coming to you.
Thank you so much. I really love this panel. I do research on women, on the driving force for sustainability development in a VUCA world. I really believe that women are that. But my question to you now it is, can we imagine building public-private partnerships to build a women-friendly planet, because the reality is women are the first victims of if everything is going wrong on the planet, economically, politically, or socially. So I work with investors, and you are right, but what shows the data also is that the return on investment on women-led or women-owned businesses, it's much higher than those led by men. That's the data showing. So there is here a profit interest, I would say, in investing in women, for sure. And my second question is about the role of religion in shaping the genders behaviors that we talked about. And I want to share with you good news. Religion can also help women. I work with the cabinet of the president of Zambia, and led by Christian churches, they created an interfaith association which work with the Zambian government. And now in Zambia, women can inherit their families. They can own land and businesses, and of course they can have access to, I'm writing a case study about that. So I think it's really important to consider that those, what are the factors that determine that systemic barriers, and religions and institutions are among the most important. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so we want to tackle kind of what UN and World Bank is doing, particularly on advocacy and some places where women's rights are still really at threat, as well as thinking about how we message this work in this certain climate. I know a lot of people are talking about that. And then you're being able to build that resilience in to women's economic empowerment programs, as well as the religious piece. So we only have 6 minutes left to solve all of that. But what I'll do is just have each of you give a couple minutes responding to those that you feel like you want to contribute to.
Shall I start? Okay, just a few words on a few questions. So the World Bank indeed has a gender strategy. It's actually been revamped very recently. It has strong global targets that it aims to reach and that are much more ambitious than in the past. So it does advocacy across governments through the dialogue with the governments on these goals, and including on issues that are very complicated related to women's rights. But the World Bank, as you know, works with governments, and so that's the channel that they have to influence. We at CGAP do a lot of advocacy, much more directly, but of course focused much more on women's financial inclusion. So yes, definitely these issues really matter for the World Bank. On shifting priorities and how you position things, I think we tackled that quite nicely in our conversation by saying, these things, the importance of gender equality goes well beyond what is fair or what is ideologic. It's an economic opportunity. It's a resilience opportunity. So you can present it by lifting it to the jobs market. Women that have access to finance are 28% more likely to become an entrepreneur than otherwise. So you're creating jobs. Lots of governments at the moment have youth employment in mind as what's keeping them from sleeping at night. So linking to global priorities. I'll talk just about the resilience. Resilience is fundamental, including resilience to economic, financial, food security, climate shocks, you name it. And our work shows that women, especially in the household, but also in the community, can be agents of resilience. But they are also the least equipped to have access to the tools and the voice that they need to play that role. And so that's why we go back to the need to empower them with the financial tools, the savings, the insurance, the credit that they need, and the agency that they need. But
And
I would say there are a few things that I would want to highlight from these questions. And the first is that I think we have to, as we think about difficult countries, and I mentioned Afghanistan, but there are many other countries where it's very difficult, even impossible, to work at that moment. That's where we really need to have community. And I talked a lot about how we're trying to build community. I think that shouldn't be underestimated in times like this. It may not be the capital infusion that we want to see, may not be the programmatic activities that we think are going to move the needle, but there's always something that can be done. And sometimes that sense of community will drive hope. And there's always reason to lose your optimism, but you shouldn't lose your hope. And so I think that is something that as allies, we want to keep supporting that. I think the good question about how do you message this, my suggestion would be, You keep doing the same work, and you talk about it which way you need to talk about it, because it's the work that matters, it's not the words. Sometimes the words matter, but at this moment, what really matters is the work. And some of us have been around long enough to have used a whole lot of different words at a whole lot of different times, and the work remains the work. So specifically, I think it's really important for the audience we have now here in the US. It is about America first, and it is about thinking about data and evidence. And I applaud that push for data and evidence, because I think for far too long, we've talked about many of the things we do, particularly around gender, as an inherent good. And we've given ourselves sometimes a free pass. And so I think finding ways to have the data linked to the anecdotes will be very powerful, and I think very well received. The other thing, the third piece I wanted to mention about the social norms and things, I've lived in Zambia, and at a time I was living there, one of the women who was running for office was really beaten down in the press because she was divorced. And they said, well, if you can't even hold on to your husband, how are you gonna hold on to an office? And she didn't win. I don't know if that was the only reason she didn't win, but I think we have to keep pushing on what are the social norms and how do we unpack those in constructive and culturally appropriate ways, which again is another thing that I think the community is being held up for now as having done not so well. And so we need to remember that this is with nuance and it needs to be done with sensitivity, but that if we don't tackle those things, women are going to be held back, because no matter how many good examples there are enough other examples of where women have held themselves apart and not put themselves forward because they're afraid of the kind of critique they may get publicly.
Nicole, quick final last word.
Yeah, quick final last words. I mean, on the UN, I mean, many of you may be familiar with UN Women. Certainly there is a lot of advocacy that happens day in, day out. I mentioned Commission on the Status of Women happening now. Of course, rooted in Goal 5 of the SDGs, but really importantly, it's not just about Goal 5, which is about gender equality, but all of the SDGs. And I would just note on that, thinking about the different entry points and processes, really across the UN agencies, but one upcoming, this point about integration is the high-level political forum that's happening in June. This year's focusing on Goal 3, which is health, Goal 5, which is women, Goal 8, which is jobs, right? To that point of like, let's think about how this integrates for everyone's benefit, for not just men and women. And just lastly, just to, I didn't get a chance to comment on data because everybody was saying such really important points, but just to kind of plus one on the data. And as it relates to the question about tweaking research, I think in this era, continuing to build that data, think about disaggregation generally, right? We need disaggregation on sort of all levels. And it's also about not just getting the data, building the evidence, but conveying it and communicating it in a way that's going to speak. So we, think creatively about how we make data interactive, how we visualize that data, and really make it useful and accessible, not only to policymakers, but to the public at large. I mean, to Anne's point, I really liked what you said about, it's not necessarily about the words, although sometimes it is, but it is about the work. And I mean, it's about that with the research too. It's as much about how you communicate and sort of, deploy the message and that data and evidence as it is about the kind of collection and use of it. And I think there's a lot of opportunity. This morning during the opening plenary, I talked about, when we think about, just to go back to where we started, and I'll end on this, sort of development assistance and sort of foreign assistance. And we've been doing work here at the Atlantic Council. I've been doing this work around positive economic statecraft, which is a whole different way to sort of think and talk about using our foreign assistance tools and development assistance tools in ways that better further our economic and national security interests in balance with some of the other tools of the toolbox. So I think, if we want to talk about women's empowerment, it's the same thing. We need to think about all of our tools. We need to coordinate better. We need to bring everyone to the table, especially women.
Well, thank you for helping lay out the barriers and the opportunities so clearly for us. So thank you, Nicole, Anne, and Sophie. Please join me in giving them a round of applause.
Thank you, Kate.
Thank you, Kate. Thank you.